On the night of November 30th, 2018, a 54-year-old woman named Jacquelyn Smith stood in front of her bathroom mirror in Baltimore, Maryland, putting on her earrings. She was getting ready to go out for the evening. She was humming to herself. Jackie was excited. Not for the birthday party exactly. That was going to be a little awkward, if she was being honest with herself, but because of where she was going to be in a week. In just 7 days, Jackie was going to be on a plane to California. Her oldest son was graduating from college. Her baby boy, the little kid she used to read to at bedtime, was about to walk across the stage in a cap and gown. She couldn't wait. So Jackie finished her earrings, she grabbed her coat, she gave herself one last look in the mirror, smiled, and headed out the door to meet her husband. She had absolutely no idea that within 30 days her name would be known in every corner of the country, that Oprah Winfrey herself would be tweeting about her, that the entire city of Baltimore would be holding its breath because of her, and that what was about to unfold over the next few hours would set off one of the strangest, most twisted investigations the Baltimore Police Department had ever seen in years. This is the story of Jacquelyn Smith. Now, to really feel the weight of what was about to happen, you've got to know who Jackie actually was, because Jackie wasn't a name and a headline. Jackie was a person, and Jackie was the kind of person you'd be lucky to know. Jacquelyn Ann was born on the 4th of July in 1964 in Providence, Rhode Island. Her mother was raising 4 kids on almost nothing, and there were stretches when there wasn't much in the fridge and definitely no money for new clothes. But what that little house did have in absolute spades was love, and from the time Jackie was small, she just absorbed it and gave it right back out. She was by every account an extraordinary kid, smart, driven, a little bit too mature for her age. By the time Jackie hit middle school, she was actually begging her mother to transfer her to a different school because she felt the curriculum was too easy. In her own words, she said her current school was making her feel dumb. Who talks like that in the 7th grade? Jackie did. By high school, she had been hand selected to attend one of the most prestigious schools in all of Rhode Island. By the time she graduated, she had an engineering scholarship in her back pocket and a bus ticket to college in North Carolina. And after college, Jackie did what Jackie always did. She crushed it. She landed a great engineering job. She married a fellow engineer named Derek, a guy who had famously stood up at a college basketball game and announced to the whole entire crowd that he was going to marry her one day, and who actually made good on his promise. Together they had 2 sons, Kendall and David, and Jackie poured herself into being a mother, the way she poured herself into everything, completely, fearlessly, with her whole entire heart. But marriages don't always last, and in 2005, after years of trying to make it work, Jackie and Derek divorced. And here's where someone else might have crumbled. At 42 years old, a 42-year-old woman, suddenly single, 2 boys to raise, a career that had taken hits because of years of moving around for her husband's military career. But Jackie didn't crumble. Jackie just got up the next morning and kept going. She landed a serious job at Aberdeen Proving Ground, a major army facility outside of Baltimore. She bought herself a house. She raised her boys. She built herself a life, brick by brick, all on her own. And in 2013, after almost a decade of being single, Jackie walked into her best friend Michelle's 45th birthday. She wasn't looking for anything that night. She was just there to celebrate her friend. But across the room, a man she had never met in her life looked up from his drink. His name was Keith Smith. Keith Tyrone Smith was a 47-year-old truck driver from Baltimore. Like Jackie, he'd been married before. Like Jackie, he had kids from another marriage. And on this particular night, a mutual friend had dragged him to a party where he barely knew anyone. So he was just kind of hanging back, sipping a drink, scanning the room. And then his eyes landed on Jacquelyn. The people who were at the party would later say that the chemistry between Jackie and Keith was instant. They danced, they laughed, they talked all night. They couldn't get enough of each other. And from that night on, you basically didn't see one without the other. They were electric. Within 3 months, Keith was on one knee holding a ring out, and Jackie, who for years had told her closest friends that all she wanted was a man who would truly love her and truly put her first, looked down at this man kneeling in front of her, and she said yes without hesitation. Now, I'll be honest with you. Some of Jackie's friends thought all of this was happening way too fast, but Jackie was almost 50 years old. She was not a kid. She had been married before. She had been a mother now for 2 decades. She had spent 10 years on her own figuring out what she wanted out of life. And what she wanted finally was right in front of her. So 6 months later, on Jackie's 50th birthday, she and Keith got married. It should have been the happiest day of her life, and from the photos, it looked like it was. Big smiles, beautiful dress, guests laughing, a perfect summer. But there was a shadow over that wedding, and that shadow had a name. Her name was Valeria. Valeria was Keith's grown daughter from a previous relationship. And from the very first moment Valeria heard her father was getting remarried, she had hated the idea. She didn't want a stepmother. She didn't want anyone else in her father's life. And on the day of the wedding, between the ceremony and the reception, Valeria pulled Keith aside and absolutely unloaded on him, screamed at him, made a scene so loud that the other guests could hear it from down the hall. She made Jackie cry on her own wedding day, on her own birthday. Valeria was eventually asked to leave the celebration, but the damage was done. And years later, Jackie's friends would look at the pictures from that day and they'd say you could actually see it on her face, that beneath the smile there was already heartbreak. But Jackie did what Jackie always did. She pressed forward. She forgave. She tried to build a relationship with this stepdaughter who didn't want her. She hoped that given enough time, things would soften. And for the next 4.5 years, on the surface at least, life was beautiful. Keith and Jackie went on vacations, they threw dinner parties, they went out dancing, they bought a house, they even bought a small yacht. From the outside looking in, they had it all. And on the night of November 30th, 2018, Keith and Jackie did something incredibly generous. They took Valeria, the same Valeria who had made Jackie cry at her own wedding, out to celebrate her birthday at an American Legion Hall in downtown Baltimore. Because that's who Jackie was. She forgave. She kept showing up. The party was nice. Not amazing, not awful, just nice. The three of them ate. They laughed a little. They took some pictures. Jackie smiled in every single one of them. And as the clock crept closer to midnight, they all decided it was time to call it a night. So just before 12, Jackie buckled up her seatbelt in the passenger seat of Keith's black Audi A7. Valeria climbed into the back. Keith slid behind the wheel, and the three of them pulled out of the parking lot and started to drive home. Jackie was tired. It had been a long evening. She leaned her head back against the headrest and watched the streetlights flicker by through her window. She was thinking about how, even with all of the awkwardness with Valeria, it had been a pretty nice evening, all things considered. And then, somewhere in East Baltimore, on a rundown one-way street called Valley Street, Keith slowed down the car. Jackie looked up ahead. On the sidewalk, in the drizzle and the cold, was a young woman. And in this young woman's arms was a baby. The woman was asking for money. Jackie didn't even hesitate. She turned to her husband and asked him to please pull over, because that's what Jackie was. She could not drive past a person in need, not ever, especially not a woman with a baby, especially not on a freezing night in December, a week before Christmas. Keith pulled over. Jackie rolled down her window and held out a $10 bill. The woman took it, thanked her quietly, and stepped back from the car. And it should have ended right there, but it didn't, because as soon as the woman had the money, a man stepped out of the shadows behind her. Keith would later tell police that this man walked up to the driver's side of the Audi, leaned down to Keith's window, and very politely asked if he could thank Keith's wife personally. Keith said sure. The man stepped closer, the man leaned in, and in one explosive, horrible motion, The man lunged across Keith's body, plunged a knife into Jacquelyn Smith, ripped the necklace right off her neck, snatched the wallet from her lap, took off running into the dark with the woman beside him. Keith said he leapt out of the car. He chased them for a few seconds, but then he turned around, saw his wife bleeding in the passenger seat, and realized none of it mattered. What mattered was getting her to the hospital. So he jumped back in the Audi, threw it into drive, and tore off through the empty Baltimore streets towards Hopkins, screaming into his phone the entire time at 911 dispatcher the entire way. He made it to the emergency room in record time. But 15 minutes after they wheeled Jackie through those doors, the doctors came out to the waiting room and they looked at Keith and they looked at Valeria, who was still shaking in the corner. And they told them as gently as they could that Jacquelyn Smith was gone. She had been stabbed straight through the heart and the lungs. There was nothing anyone could have done. She was 54 years old. The story tore through Baltimore like a wildfire. And then it tore through the country. A grieving husband, a traumatized stepdaughter, a beautiful, kind, generous woman murdered in cold blood for the crime of rolling down her window to help a stranger. It was every commuter's worst nightmare. It was the kind of story that makes you reach over and lock your car doors at the next red light without even thinking about it. Keith was everywhere. He was on the news, he was on local TV, he was on national TV. He told the cameras that you never knew what people's intentions really were anymore. He said his Jackie had not died in vain, and that he was going to push for a city ban on panhandling in her name. He said he was going to make sure of it. The message exploded. It went all the way up to Oprah Winfrey, who had started her career in Baltimore and who tweeted about Jackie's story, saying that her own heart was broken, that she had given money to people on the street 1,000 times in her life, and that she would think twice before ever doing it again. A wave of fear swept through the country. People stopped giving. People stopped looking each other in the eye. And at the center of all of it stood Keith Smith, the heartbroken widower, holding his stepdaughter's hand in front of news cameras and pleading with the public for help finding the monsters who had done this to his wife. Meanwhile, the Baltimore Police Department was working around the clock to do exactly that, and right out of the gate, they ran into a problem. They couldn't find any evidence. A team of officers had flooded Valley Street within hours of the murder. They combed every inch of that block, every gutter, every alley, every shadow, because somewhere out of there had to be a knife, or a drop of blood, or a fingerprint, or something. They found nothing. Not a single witness, not a drop of blood, not even a resident in any of the surrounding buildings who said they heard a scream that night. In fairness, it had been raining heavily, so maybe the rain had washed everything away. Maybe. Then they tore Keith's Audi apart. Forensics combed through the entire vehicle looking for any trace of this stranger who had supposedly leaned in and stabbed Jackie. A hair, a skin cell, a fingerprint on the door frame, anything. They found Jackie's blood, they found Keith's DNA, they found Valeria's DNA, they found a piece of a fake fingernail and a pair of gloves, and nothing else. There was zero physical evidence that a fourth person had ever been near that car. So the police pivoted. They pushed out into Baltimore's homeless communities, talking to anyone who would talk back, hoping someone somewhere knew something. And it didn't take long before they started hearing the same name come up over and over and over again. Baby J was a small-time guy with a long rap sheet and a girlfriend and a baby. The streets were saying Baby J had finally crossed the line. The police chased him for days. When they finally got him into an interrogation room, they were sure they had their guy, until Baby J calmly told them that on that night Jackie was killed, he had been at a motel on the other side of town with his girlfriend and his baby, and he was on the motel surveillance cameras the entire night. It was airtight. Baby J couldn't have done it. It was physically impossible. And just like that, the only solid lead the Baltimore Police Department had completely fell apart. Sitting back at their desks with no leads and no suspects and not a shred of physical evidence, the detectives started to feel something they did not want to feel. Something didn't add up. So they went back to the beginning. They reread every word of Keith and Valeria's statements. They re-interviewed Jackie's family and friends. But this time, they didn't just ask about Jackie. This time, they asked about Keith. They asked about Valeria. They asked about the relationship between the three of them. And what they heard changed everything. Because Jackie's friends told them that Valeria had never accepted Jackie. That for years and years, the tension had simmered just beneath the surface. They told them that Valeria had a hard adult life, that she had battled addiction, that she had a rap sheet of her own. Drugs, assault, domestic violence with a knife. The detectives looked at each other. They started building a brand new theory. What if Valeria had set this whole thing up? What if she had paid someone to pose as a panhandler? What if Jackie, trusting, kind, generous Jackie, had been a pawn in her own murder, and the person who had moved her into place was the stepdaughter who had hated her from day one? So they pulled Valeria's cell phone records. They were looking for suspicious calls, suspicious texts, a hired killer. What they found instead changed the case forever, because Valeria's phone had GPS data, and the GPS data did not match Keith's story. Not even a little bit. Remember, Keith had told the police very specifically that after leaving the American Legion that night, he had driven southeast through Baltimore and ended up on Valley Street, where the panhandler had attacked his wife. Valeria's phone said that after they left the American Legion, the car had gone in the exact opposite direction, northeast, and it had not gone anywhere near Valley Street. Instead, the car had pulled into a place called Druid Hill Park, and it had stopped there. And it had stayed there for a while. The detectives stared at this data, and the floor of the room felt like it was tilting underneath their feet. So they double checked. They pulled traffic camera footage from 30 different cameras between the American Legion Hall and the Valley Street. 30 cameras that should have caught Keith's Audi at least once somewhere along that route. The Audi was on 0 of them. 0. Whatever had happened to Jackie that night, it had not happened on Valley Street. And that meant the entire story Keith Smith had been telling the police, the cameras, and the entire country was a lie. The detectives brought Keith and Valeria back in separately, and they hit them with the GPS data. Valeria immediately lawyered up. She wouldn't say a word. Keith tried to talk his way out of it. He told the police that he had gotten lost on the way home. He had told them that he had pulled into Druid Hill Park to look at some pictures from the party and to change music on his phone. It almost sounded reasonable. Just one problem. The detectives had already pulled Keith's phone records, and on the night of the murder, Keith's phone had been turned off. So had Jackie's. There were no pictures being looked at, there was no music being played, and Keith had no explanation for why two phones in that car had gone completely dark right before a woman was stabbed to death. The lead detective leaned across the table and told him point blank, "We don't know how, and we don't know why yet, but we know you had something to do with your wife's death." Keith just put his head on the table, and softly, slowly, he said one word over and over again: "Wow." But the police still didn't have enough to arrest him. Not yet. Not the kind of evidence that would survive a courtroom anyway. So they had to let him walk, and they had to let Valeria walk. Then the lab results came back on Jackie's body, and what they found rewrote the entire case one more time. Because all over Jackie's body, on her hands, on her arms, in places consistent with someone fighting for her life, was an enormous amount of DNA. And it didn't belong to a stranger. It didn't even belong to Valeria. It belonged to Keith. Massive, violent, hand-to-hand transfer amounts of it. The kind you only get from a brutal close quarters struggle. the kind you get when one person is stabbing another person to death. The detectives had been wrong. Valeria hadn't been the killer. Valeria had only helped cover it up. The person who actually plunged a knife into Jacquelyn Smith over and over again that night in the dark was the one person in the world she trusted the most. The man who had been holding her hand at the birthday party. The man she had married on her own birthday. And as the investigation deepened, the why finally came into focus. An anonymous source came forward and told the police that Keith had been having an affair, that Jackie had found out, that Jackie had brought up the word divorce. And here's the thing about divorce, it would have been a catastrophe for Keith, because Keith had quietly downgraded his own job to part-time after the wedding. Every house, every vacation, every dinner, every dress, the yacht, all of it was being funded by Jackie's powerful engineering salary. If Jackie walked away, Keith walked away with absolutely nothing, unless Jackie didn't walk. Unless Jackie died. And it gets worse because Jackie had a life insurance policy through her job, and Keith was the sole beneficiary. If Jackie died of natural causes, Keith would collect somewhere around $250,000. Not bad. But if Jackie died as the victim of a homicide, a senseless random violent act of street crime, then, under the terms of that policy, Keith stood to collect nearly $1 million. Keith had filed his claim with Jackie's employer within days of her death. Keith knew the noose was tightening, so Keith did the only thing a guilty man could do. He rented a moving truck, he packed up half the house he had shared with Jackie, and he drove 1,000 miles south to Winter Haven, Florida, leaving Valeria behind in Baltimore to sweat it out alone. But the police weren't done. They got a wiretap on his phone. They got one on Valeria's too. And they sat there, headphones on, listening to everything come apart in real time. Valeria was unraveling. She was calling her father hysterics. She was furious that he had abandoned her. She couldn't handle the pressure. Keith tried to calm her down. He promised that he would bring her to Florida. He promised he would protect her. Then Keith started calling travel agents. He was trying to book trips to Cuba, Mexico, Canada, anywhere with the border. The travel agents kept telling him he needed a passport. Keith didn't have one. So Keith pulled out his phone, the same phone the police were listening to, and Googled, and I am not making this up, where can you cross the border without going through customs? That was enough. The detectives started drawing up an arrest warrant. But while they were drafting it, the GPS data on his phone lit up like a Christmas tree. Keith was on the move. He had driven all the way back up to Maryland. He had picked up Valeria, and the two of them were now flying south fast, heading towards the border. And then their phones went dark. They had figured out they were being tracked. The Baltimore police called in. The feds tapped into the national license plate reader system. Hours ticked by. Officers sat in front of screens watching, waiting, praying. Finally, a hit came back. Brownsville, Texas, 20 minutes from the Mexican border. The Texas Rangers were given the green light. They raced, and in the absolute last possible window on a stretch of Texas highway, they intercepted that car and pulled out Keith Tyrone Smith and his daughter Valeria out of the front seats and put them in handcuffs. Here's what really happened on the night of November 30th, 2018. When Keith pulled out of the parking lot of that American Legion Hall with his wife in the passenger seat and his daughter in the back, Jackie was tired. It had been a long evening. She had leaned her head against the window, closed her eyes, and let the hum of the road carry her under. She fell asleep in the car. She trusted the man behind the wheel. She had no reason not to. Keith did not drive his wife home. Keith drove his wife in the exact opposite direction, north and west, into Druid Hill Park, to a quiet, deserted spot in the dark. He turned off his phone. He reached over and turned off Jackie's phone, too. He took out a knife and he stabbed his sleeping wife to death right there in the front seat of the car they had taken on so many vacations together, while his own daughter sat in the back seat too high and too scared and too loyal to him to stop him. Then he drove her body to the hospital and told the entire country a story about a stranger in the night. There was never a polite man asking for permission to thank her. None of it ever happened. Keith Smith made the whole thing up. He used the most vulnerable people in the city of Baltimore as a smokescreen for his own crime. He used his own daughter as an alibi, and he used his wife's famous, beautiful generosity, the very thing that made her Jackie, as the bait in his own story. In court, Valeria flipped on her father in exchange for a reduced sentence. She told the jury everything. She got 10 years with 5 suspended. Keith got the maximum. On December 9th, 2021, Keith Tyrone Smith was found guilty of the first-degree murder of his wife, Jacquelyn Smith, and sentenced to life in prison. You know, if you think that was a husband hiding something behind a smile, you have no idea what's waiting for you in the next one. There's another story sitting right at the top of the screen for you right now. Another house where everything looked perfect from the outside. Another person who had no idea who they were really living with. And the way that one ends is going to stay with you for a long, long time. Click it. I'll see you over there.